Welcome to Dorsey and Whitney's webinar on Moving Beyond COVID-19, UK Growth Companies in a Time of Uncertainty. I'd like to introduce Frances Doherty, a partner in Dorsey's London office and co-chair of Dorsey's Technology Industry Group. Fran?
Thanks, Rima. So I'm really excited to be speaking about this today. We are in week 10 of the lockdown in the UK, and as things start to move towards getting back to life as we may have known it before, if anyone can remember that far back, we thought it would be a good idea to have a presentation on sort of moving beyond COVID-19 and what the future holds. And I'm delighted to be joined by John Spindler of Capital Enterprise. John, do you want to just give everybody a little overview of who you are, first of all?
Hi gang, hi everyone. I am John Spindler. I'm the CEO of Capital Enterprise. Capital Enterprise is a not-for-profit organisation that supports entrepreneurs predominantly in London, but increasingly across the rest of the UK, particularly tech entrepreneurs, those that are basically trying to commercialise some fundamental innovation that they have developed. We run a number of programmes basically focused at supporting those groups. I'm also the founder and partner of a couple of seed stage investment basic funds, like our investment fund and the AI seed. I'm also a venture partner on a Series A fund that does deep tech called Luminous Ventures. And I also I suppose one of the grey beards of the London tech scene, having basically been a personal investor and kind of involved in setting up and supporting startups since really 2012. Although when you're 51, as I am, 8 years seems quite a short time. I've noticed that I'm now one of the kind of long-standing members of the London tech scene.
Yeah.
So that's myself.
Well, I can bear witness to the fact that you are one of the most well-connected people that I know in the London tech scene. Maybe I should say I am co-chair of the Technology Industry Group at Dorsey, and I'm also an emerging companies partner in the London office. Before we get started, some housekeeping. We will deal with questions at the end, the last final 15 minutes. So please, if you would like to ask a question, if you could just comment on the chat button, and I'll make sure that we clear them up during, at that last 15 minutes. We've got a hard stop of 4 o'clock, which means that we will be efficient and make sure that we get on with business. And then just for any American participants, unfortunately, this one doesn't qualify for CLE in the US. Right, so let's get started. So this is called Moving Beyond COVID-19, but I think we do need to talk about the pandemic. And let's talk, first of all, John, on your perspectives on what the macro issues are. So what are the big issues that are facing the UK economy right now? And I guess how many of them are really related to COVID and how many of them were pre-existing?
Well, it's a good point, actually, and there are obviously COVID that reveals underlying weaknesses as well as strengths in the economy. And you could say definitely that has occurred in the UK. And the UK is predominantly a service-based economy, and as such is very much dependent on people. And one of the things that's happened over the last 10 weeks, as you mentioned, the lockdown, and actually probably a couple of weeks before that, as it became apparent that COVID was ripping through basically Europe, and particularly cities like London, we've had lockdown, and anything that requires human interaction has effectively, real world human interaction has effectively stopped. And as we speak in the UK, today is the first day that some schools are back, and in about a couple of weeks' time, some retailers will be back, but actually the most of the British economy probably won't be back now working anywhere near where we were in, say, February this year until probably September, October. So obviously that has made a massive impact. It's had a big impact on basically how companies operate, and companies have had to do 3 kind of steps to basically look at how this particularly affects them. They've looked at strategically, has it really stopped their basic plans, their routes to basically achieving profitability? In tech, what we often say, the routes to achieving product market fit, or the product market fit they had, believe they had, it was scaling companies before COVID, does it still pertain? Will we get back to that? And then people have been looking at offensive and defensive strategies. And if you look at the big macro effect, the key thing to come forward out of this and become more apparent as we go on from this is that this has really affected demand. The big shock here has not been a credit crunch, and we'll explain why that's not been the case. A lot of that is government action here, States, Europe, everywhere. But what has been is a big, basically, drop-off in demand. And you're looking at, that's been why basic industries have seen such a big collapse. It's people have not been out there buying. People have not been out there transacting. And the truth is we do not know whether that demand will bounce back. And anyone who says that it will bounce back is basically, who can confidently say it will be, is probably
a charlatan. Charlatan.
Yeah, well, not necessarily a charlatan, because we all have to live on hopes and we all plan for the future, but we just do not know whether some of the impacts that COVID have brought forward are short-term, or some of them are actually long-term. But the biggest problem that all companies are facing at the moment is their demand. Is there basic customers there wanting to buy your services and products? And obviously some sectors and industries are effectively saying they are locked out of basically finding out whether there is demand. Obviously physical retail, obviously companies involved in travel, obviously companies that do an experience economy, etc. But others have found that actually demand has fallen not because of actually the lockdown, but because of the reaction of companies to preserve their cash, to basically stop new projects going ahead, to basically stop the sales cycle, which was, basically was working before basically March this year. They've not allowed that to come back. And in tech, since most tech is in that area, that's what they're seeing is, are there new customers? Are there existing customers still buying? And that's where the problem lies. And we're still uncertain whether we will get a V-shaped recovery, i.e. in September or October, we'll all be back to normal, or whether we'll get a U-shaped economy, we'll be staggering along at the bottom, gradually going up, basically for the next year or two, or whether we'll have an L-shaped. And obviously, some of our L-shaped fear is to do with whether you can predict in the UK, whether we'll get out of this wave. We still, in the UK, and probably the same in the States, I mean, on Friday, we were still seeing 8,000 new people basically being affected a day. That is in lockdown. We were seeing over 300 deaths per day in lockdown, which is greater than any other country in Europe by a certain amount of factors. So we're coming out of lockdown, while in a situation unlike other European countries where the virus is still raging.
Yeah.
And the second big issue is on that is that will we have a second wave?
Second wave, yeah.
And the second wave comes in, and it's likely to come in more in September, October, when we are more indoors and the disease spreads quicker and more viciously. Can we cope with that, or will we have to go back to another lockdown? And that's a little bit.
And what's your prediction if we have to go into another lockdown then? Because that's,
well, even if you don't go,
apocryphal stories seem to be suggesting that's given that we are coming out. We're coming out of lockdown now when we still have 300 plus deaths a day, suggests that we can't really avoid a second peak.
We're being told that we're very connected to the universities and the hospital groups in London, particularly through our partners like UCL and King's College and Imperial Queen Mary. And they are basically forecasting a second wave in basically kind of September and October. And they are basically not going back to full elective surgeries, for instance, until next year. They're not allowing clinical trials and studies, which are really important for my medtech startups, to start this year. And you can argue that basically some of the actions on universities in the UK, I suspect most universities in the UK will not open in October. I suspect they'll wait till January. I can't say that's true, but the rumours that we get from our universities is that's likely to happen, at least in London. And we are aware that some universities like Cambridge, which is only 50 miles from where I'm at, have obviously decided to go completely virtual next year. Now, I know that's not the same in the States. The States, universities and colleges are still kind of focused on an October back to campus, but that is a kind of an indication. And there's two things about this. One is confidence. Will people have confidence to go back to the office, to shop in the real world, to book those travel plans? Some will, but obviously a large part won't. And then if you look at the track and trace, which is supposed to replace, think about it, if it gets so big, how difficult that would be, and how many people are really going to basically, once they're told that they may be in contact with someone, to really isolate for 14 days, if that is a period crucial to your business.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, we found out from the data in the UK that only half of the population are observing basically self-isolation as it is. So I suspect it'll be even less. But let's not frighten ourselves. I mean, the whole country in Britain, I expect in the States, are just keen to get on with it now. We're coming to a stage, especially young people who are less physically and their health is less impacted by this, are so keen to get back out. It's a lovely weather, and you can see
their health is less impacted, but they are also more impacted by the downturn. I think when we talked, you talked about something like unemployment between 18 and 25-year-olds is sort of gone off the charts.
The latest figures in the UK, and we've got some schemes here that have really flattened that. In the States, you're talking about 40 million people registered unemployed, and there may be some factors behind the payments there that encourages that. But in the UK, we're talking about 2 million people unemployed, registered for unemployed now, and we have 8.4 million people on the furlough scheme, where they basically are paid by the government on the job retention scheme not to work and get 80% of their salaries up to £2,500, about $3,500 per month to basically support their themselves while they're
which is coming to an end, and we will touch upon that sort of.
And you have to say how many of those people. I mean, some of the figures when you look at them are quite shocking. There was 1 million people, basically, who work in the creative sector on furlough. 1 million people, of which over 80% are based in London. And the creative sectors are going to be probably have so much more of the human interaction, are probably one of the last sectors that are going to come out of this. The theatres, making of films, the artists, the studios, etc., etc. So where it's a completely different type of basic recession that we would have ever seen before, because certain sectors are not that impacted and can carry on working, but others which are the bad bedrocks of certain knowledge economies, like the creative sector, are very much impacted. So we just don't know. What the evidence suggests is that it will be young people basically who are being most impacted. They are often the first ones in, first ones out. Basically, they congregate in early entry jobs in sectors that have been particularly impacted by this. And obviously, the same in the USA and here is every year we get about 500,000 to 1 million young people that come onto the labour market in the summer, and God knows where they're going to go and work.
Okay, so we both work in the tech sector, so maybe if we could talk about what the big issues are facing the tech sector right now, and again talking about which are directly related to COVID and which ones are more sort of pre-existing conditions.
Well, I work in the startup tech sector because we have to probably put a distinction there, because it's obvious that big tech has had a very good COVID. Amazon basically kind of is roaring. Kind of Google is doing incredibly well. Even Facebook with their advertising income are still basically becoming more and more of an essential part of our lives.
Which is why the US stock market seems to be barely affected by what's happening.
And why the Europeans, especially the UK, that actually has virtually no tech within it, and has lots of oil and mining stocks and banking stocks, hasn't recovered as much. So you're quite right, but big tech has had a really good, basically, Brexit, and we can see that they're capturing more market share. And we understand over the weekend we had Amazon buying a UK company here called Beacon. They're on an acquisition basically kind of charge to buy new companies and to strengthen their position. And if I was them, so would I. They've got a big cash pile. They've got more money coming in. They've seen a lot of assets which are probably undervalued. They're going to be more aggressive in the market. But startups, I think startups are in a different big, and the way I work with startups, I'm looking at the market which is pre-seed, which are people coming out and developing new technologies and new business model innovations and entering to the market for the first time. I'm looking at people that have had a seed round and are trying to get to product market fit. And I'm looking at the people who have achieved that and go for their first scale, probably internationally, basically, or if it's in a highly regulated market like medical, they've got their regulatory approvals now, they've completed their clinical trials, and are now ready to rock and roll and start to sell their basic innovation. I see all of those have been impacted in different ways. We normally invest in deep tech, and one of the big problems in deep tech has been the universities. The universities have shut down. You cannot get into the university labs. This has basically delayed all the deep tech startups, and we've had lots of them working on COVID, where the biggest frustration has been you cannot get physically into the labs, because I think in many ways universities overcompensated and shut all their facilities. And so there's some of the big companies as well, which has not helped. Also, university education itself is going to be curtailed in one way or another. They're going to have massive bites out of their funding this year. So we've seen it there on the deep tech side. We're seeing it on the early stages in the sense that people normally spend a year to 2 years developing an idea to get it to market, and the market they were trying to get that product into has changed.
Yeah.
Although it's easy in principle to pivot when you're early, much more easy when you're later, psychologically it's very difficult to kind of, rip up that research, rip up that customer development and start afresh. And we're trying to encourage our startups to do that, to think strategically where the new market opportunities will be, what has really affected that market. Will we have, for instance, if we have lots of young people unemployed, we're going to have to look at business models which do not require them to pay up front because they won't have money. We're going to have to basically look at the longer term.
So can you give me an example of a company, you don't necessarily need, or a technology where they've had to do that pivot? You don't need to give me a name, but just a.
We've had a lot. We've had a lot of companies that are doing enterprise sales, which have a very long sales cycle.
Yeah.
Which normally require you to have high touch. You go to conferences, you go to exhibitions, you meet the buyers from these large corporations numerous times. You pitch all the way up. It's normally a 3, 6 months, 9 months, a year cycle. That stopped, and what they've been all trying to do is go to what we call SaaS on demand, is have much simpler products. They break down their products into simpler modules that can be basically used by the practitioners and not have to go through the entire procurement process. So we've had one of our companies, for instance, Hazy, that does synthetic database building, has had to break down their product into very simple chunks so it can actually get basically kind of bought and sold in a much easier way than their basic big platform play was.
Would that have had to happen anywhere, or is COVID?
I think SaaS on demand
more important.
Moving that way, which is to basically using putting things on the cloud. You could say one of the things that's happened of COVID is that cloud based services have had a field time. This is why Microsoft and Amazon, to some extent Google, have done so well. Is virtually anyone who was on-prem software has now gone to cloud, or have to take some of their operations onto cloud. And when you're on cloud, when you're basically not having to integrate into a server in an office, but you can do one integration into the cloud, it leans to more basic business models like SaaS on demand. And I think you're right, that was going on anyway. You can just look at the growth of AWS and Azure in Microsoft, AWS and Amazon, etc., to see that. But I think that's been accelerated. And therefore, basically, that has happened with startups. And you've got much more startups now building APIs, which basically sit on platforms, which are owned by other, used to be startups, like Slack, for instance, it was a collaboration tool, or UiPath with its robotic process automation, and therefore trying to sell through those much simpler versions of their product.
So let's talk a little bit about defensive versus offensive strategies. So
I think most startups are probably now engaged their defensive strategies. The defensive strategies are all around how do you extend your runway? How do you keep basic liquid? How do you keep cash? because we cannot predict what's going to happen. So people have been making the obvious, basically, retrenchment cuts. They've cut on the acquisition costs. They're not using as many Facebook adverts, or basically, obviously, they've cut back on their sales force. They're not attending exhibitions. They're not funding travel. But they've also made painful adjustments on the staff they need. And in the UK, that's been easy because you can furlough, you can put people on, and I've seen lots of my startups have furloughed, and the key decision as it filters out, it tapers out, is whether is jobs to them when that scheme ends, or whether they are unemployed. So lots of the defensive strategies are really about basically trying to preserve cash. And very early, in around March, when this started to happen, I was at an event with lots of other VCs, probably about 100, and one of those VCs, basically on the Zoom call, obviously stood up and say, every single one of us investors have to see if their portfolio companies can make payroll in December 2021. And what's happened has been basically is that the VCs have been backing those defensive strategies as well, asking basically their portfolio companies to make the necessary cuts and changes, but also basically giving them some more money to survive. And that's defensive. We're still waiting to see what happens.
But doesn't that force VCs to choose between their portfolio companies, the ones that it might accelerate decisions about whether or not they are going to back them for that period of time?
Well, it's true that basically we basically lobbied and were successful in helping launch a scheme over in the UK called the Future Fund.
Yeah.
And one of the things when we went to the ministers and the politicians and the civil servants who run our treasury and our Department of Business in the UK, is they kept saying, well, aren't all those VCs have a lot of dry powder? Aren't they sitting on a lot of money? Can't they just basically invest in their own portfolios? Why do they need help? And we had to explain a lot of the money is actually in late stage VCs and the big VCs that want to go post Series A, Series B. But even those VCs that seem to have a lot of what we call dry powder money that they can invest, a lot of it comes with conditions. And one of those conditions is limiting how much money they can put into portfolio companies. And that's basically meant that actually there's a lot less money there to deploy to back their portfolio than you would have thought. So you're right. People have been finding out whether they are basically their favored startups of their VCs. I do recall a story told to me a few years back by a well-known VC in the UK. And I had one of their portfolio companies who were looking to raise money from me. And I asked her about it. And she said, oh, we have a 4-stage ABCD basic process, John, on all my portfolio. We have the A's, which are the ones that can call me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I will always pick up the call, and they are wonderful. That's who's going to make my portfolio. I have the B's who would call me at 2 in the morning, and I will say, basically, can you call me back in the morning? Really keen to kind of hear from you, etc., but slightly annoyed. I have the C's, which I don't basically. They call me, I shout at them and said, schedule a call in the next week or two and I will get back to you. And then I had the D's. And I said to them, who are the D's? Dead to me, John, dead to me. And I think a lot of basic people have found out that they thought they may be the ABCs, but they're
now the D's.
On their kind of VCs in a few weeks.
I mean, there was a time just at the, in the beginning of March where we were hearing lots of stories about term sheets being pulled, terms being changed. I mean, what's your experience?
We saw a few of that, especially the latter. People renegotiating the terms at the last moment to give them more basic control, trying to put in ratchet clauses or trying to kind of lower the valuation, which was agreed a few months before. We also had some term sheets pulled. We actually had quite a few term sheets. We had 3 term sheets in my portfolio, about 45, but were pulled from American investors, no longer wanting to invest outside America. Yeah. So I think that would be an interesting to be on the call. Is one of the things out of COVID is going to be more nationalistic, basic assessments of deals. Are the Americans going to invest in America, Europeans in Europe, basically Chinese in China? Ironically, very rarely is the Brits invest in their own countries. But that may be a change.
Let's move on. So winners and losers. So we've already talked about the big winners are sort of big tech, Any other winners that you can see?
Well, the winners are the ones that are kind of woken up but probably thought about it, but it's been proven, but they are necessary, basically, to their clients. And if it's B2B, there's this phrase that came very apt to me in early March. One of my startups is that they've managed to keep all their clients because they are essential not to their clients, but their clients' clients. They enable their clients to maintain basically their contracts with their clients.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing. The realness ones that are winners, because this is a demand, a basic recession. There's a lack of demand. So any technology that basically secures and stimulates demand for your clients, if it's in B2B, are the winners. Yeah. Anything that basically seen as nice to have, and even cost cutting, I've seen as not being as really as important to companies as things that stimulate demand.
Yeah.
Or things that be demand. Although there is a little bit, we have people reposition stuff. One of my companies used to be basically telling themselves about how much more you could basically generate basically from using their technology, until now they switch it around and said how much you can generate from the set budget you've got. Because there is now, from financial directors in companies across the world, they are capping the money you can spend on projects, on acquisition programs, on innovation. And it's really depressing me, because one of the things that is really depressing to me is all those corporates that I go to that would say we're all about innovation, John. Innovation is what we are. And the first budget they cut in March was their innovation project. And that was really depressing. Lots of startups have come back to me and said, well, where was that CEO was basically said in February that we're innovation or nothing, cut all their innovation budgets.
So one of the ones that we talked about when we chatted before this call was Monzo, which is a transaction-based model, which has obviously there's been a little bit of press about that and how it's been impacted. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, we've got a couple as well. I mean, fintech has been the glory of the UK, and the areas where basically fintech has had the most impact has probably been on payments. And actually, one of the things that you probably notice, I'm sure, I don't say in the States, but here, no one uses cash anymore. This, you know, it's almost frightening to get given change. Kind of like the other day, I had to pay in cash and they gave me change. I want to not touch it.
Yeah, exactly. What do you do with it? You'll find it in your pockets the next time you put those trousers on. I know what you mean.
And payments business model is taking a tiny fraction fee for basic transaction. And what's happened for the likes of the Monzos and all the others, the Revoluts, the Curves, etc., is transactions have collapsed. Because we're not in the bars. We're not buying our sandwiches. We're not basic active. We're not basic on the transport systems. We're not buying air tickets.
We're not touching in and touching out, are we?
So any model that is the great thing about those models is there was very few upfront costs. They got it on the activity, and if we had a bull market and things were going left to right, you could see their growth. You can see now where basically that we may not go in left or right in the economy. We've got a bear market. Is that how does their business model survive? And I think Monzo's a great company, and obviously they've had the succession issues as well. Obviously, their CEO being kicked upstairs and a new CEO. But fundamentally, what Monzo and others have got to do is build a business model that can work in a bear market, and that's yet to be proven. And so all those fintechs that basically were based on taking a tiny transaction fee for their activity are all basically, again, we'll be looking at their business. Now, if we all bounce back, they won't have to, and this is the decision for them, this is the fork, but we don't bounce back, who knows?
So there are other sort of technologies. So obviously collaborative working like Slack, also Zoom's the big sort of winner of this, but also things like, technology that will allow online learning, because clearly we're going to be, as you've already talked about, Cambridge is not even going back till October next year. So.
Well, the education tech, we have a panel tomorrow night looking at the impact on online learning and education tech.
Right.
Obviously, education has been in here and most of the world being closed, and then they start to kind of thing, and a lot of that has gone online. The issue with education tech has always been really the business model. Can you really make money?
Yeah.
Will people pay? I mean, I've done quite a lot of online courses in the last 10 weeks. I think I've done about 3 or 4. I must admit, I don't think I've paid for one.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and that will be the key aspect, is people are prepared to pay, say, for instance, to go to university in the UK is somewhere around $10,000. And if it's a master's course, something like $30,000, $40,000. But people are not just paying for basically teaching; they're paying obviously for the certification they get and the things that means. It's paying for the experience, and they're also paying for all the other networking opportunities and other things that help them with their longer term career. And putting that just online may not have a big impact on the learning and the teaching, but obviously will have a big impact, at least on 2 of those 3 big essentials. And with online kind of learning, I would be interested to know, once it comes back, when we go back to work, which we will eventually, we will soon, we still have that appetite? Is that one of the things that will stay, or is that one of the things that won't stay? I personally think what we'll get back to is some form of more hybrid, or basically what we do both.
So yeah,
I
think what happens when we return to workplaces, I think there will be less of a desire to go into the office every day, and people have now become quite used to working from home, and so they probably will try and do this kind of working for more of the week, which obviously has an impact on bricks and mortar commercial property. You can have sort of hot desking a lot more than maybe we've been used to doing in the past. And what about experience economy, which is obviously kind of in the toilet at the moment?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously some of that is the social distancing rules,
yeah,
etc. But some of it will be probably just as impacted by the fact that under 30s are not going to have much money.
Yeah.
And so to build a business in a market where there isn't many affluent consumers is difficult, but doable. It requires you to have business model innovation as much as anything. And so I suspect that there are startups out there with ideas to kind of see how you can basically change the way, basically a holiday kind of works, or basically an amusement basically park works, or etc. Kind of will change, and maybe even things such as drinking out, cinemas, etc. They are waiting for some new business model innovation to happen, which means that they can be still done.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll be very interested, for instance, how the Generation Zs and basically, and I suppose the kind of late millennials deal with dating. I mean, the kind of biggest driving force of socialization, especially in your teens and your 20s, basically out of this, if they're not allowed to basically meet in hot, sweaty clubs and dance on.
Well, it does really undermine, all the dating websites, and I noticed that, and I'm going to talk about old media, but in the Guardian now, instead of their blind date column, is now a Zoom call in the days of lockdown.
It seems a classic case where a Zoom experience is never the same as a real world.
Exactly. Exactly.
What's the upside?
So listen, the next
kind of like
yeah. So a reminder to everyone listening, if you wanted to pose some questions, just go ahead and do that. Right, so the next heading I've got is Science Will Save Us. So obviously, we've talked about the current crisis, the pandemic, and really, I think everyone has identified that science is at the center of kind of returning to normal life, whether it be through a vaccine, although I think we all understand that that's some way off, but also to sort of dealing with the medical implications of the pandemic. And John, that my colleague Ron Moscona advised UCL on its license of mass technology that they had developed with the Mercedes Formula One team, which was a really nice project for us. It was right at the beginning of the lockdown, and UCL had this technology that they had developed with Formula One, and they effectively they allowed the design to be used on a free license, which was quite a nice thing for them to do, and also a nice piece of work. I was actually, someone I was at university with, his brother had been taken into a hospital in Glasgow and actually had the mask. So that was quite, it kind of came back full circle that someone had given me feedback that it had actually been used, which was great. Tell me what technologies you have seen that have actively addressed the COVID crisis.
I mean, this is the first crisis possibly that we've had at the heart of it. It's not just technology, you can say technology, but we've had something which has led all of this, which is prediction modeling. We are in lockdown because of the prediction models. We are measuring all of this because of the prediction models, obviously famously done by Imperial in the UK, which is also the one that they're following in the States. And I think that's been the probably the big thing I see going forward is how modeling itself, building simulations, using machine learning and AI particularly to do that, has been the big thing which was, it's been effectively only really used in industries like finance, but have now been used across the board. And I think that's going to be the big long-term effect, is that we are going to do a lot more modeling. We're not going to be able to just do experimentation kind of development. We're going to have to do more modeling. And I think basically you can see that in drug discovery. Most of these vaccines are first of all being developed in silico, in simulated environments before they're being put, and that's why they can speed up. And by the way, I do think we should be having more vaccines. It's a stochastic process. There's only a 1 to 3% chance of any of them having, so we shouldn't be just doing 100 worldwide. We probably should be doing 500. Definitely in the UK, we should have more than 2, given the resources that we have and the expertise we have, especially in genomics. I think that's basically been the kind of key thing. And I think every industry, I hope, will start to see that if you can build a better prediction model, if you can basically prescribe action better, if you can automate processes, you're going to be much more defended from other pandemics, and you're going to have a much better advantage. And so I think that's one of the things that comes up, not just the kind of engineering skills we've had and building ventilators from scratch, or basically kind of building a testing solution, but basically and getting it authorized in matters of weeks, which we've had, and actually more coming through. I think actually at the end of this, in 9 months, 12 months, I think testing will be radically changed and much more simple, and basically with results in matters of minutes, not basically kind of days and days. And I think that will fundamentally change the way we look at our bodies as well. If we automatically, instantly keep on testing ourselves almost daily for a disease like COVID, why would it stop at COVID?
Yeah, exactly.
Why wouldn't it start to happen everywhere?
And you and I both work with Professor Phil Beals at UCL through the P4 Accelerator, and I know that Phil has been putting together something which will allow companies to get back to work before a vaccine is found. Do you have any more details on that?
Yeah, we put a group together called Little Boats. We did this in beginning of March because we were very aware that the present British strategy on testing was going to be inadequate. It was very much about having what we call lighthouse labs controlled by Public Health England, and not kind of taking anything that the Germans did, for instance, and using the resources that we have from startups, scale-ups, and university labs across the UK. And to be honest, we still don't really use them as well as we could. The myth that we don't have the labs is a lie. We have more labs in Germany, but we decided not to use them because we went down a different strategy. And some of that's still there, and some of it basically we've been in Little Boats addressing some things such as, why can't we have a saliva test? We have now proven a saliva test. We've got it FDA regulated. When you take a swab down the throat, it's very hard to do it self-administered without gagging. And actually, almost a third of the time, you do not get enough virus. So that's the reason why, if you see in the UK, they now have stopped publishing and people are tested because it's getting worse. It's not getting better. They're having to do more tests on the same people because they're using swabs. And so we built a group that built a saliva test. And then if you build a saliva test, you can do mass genomic tests. Not at the moment, the limit is roughly basically about 200 to 300 people test at a time. It takes about 4 or 5 hours. With the new genomics, we can do 10,000 in that time. And again, these are things. And what we built the Little Boats Group for is because those companies, because they were early, because they didn't have names like Roche or Abbott on them, were basically ignored by the British government, which shows a little bit, and I think also elsewhere, but the gap between government and startups and scale-ups.
Yeah.
You know, they want to go for a brand all the time.
Yeah.
You know, and they don't understand that actually their innovation, especially in the UK, our innovation system is full of startups and scale-ups. And we don't actually have that many massive, basically, corporates that are able to do this. So we built this scheme. We are now got it going. In the next month or so, we're going to try it out. So what we want to bring is to create in offices and in places of work across basically London and probably the UK, is a cocoon system where you can effectively confirm that everyone in that office is free of COVID. They've either immune because they've had it, or because they can be tested on a massively daily basis, so that we know that your cohort of workers are free from COVID. And if we can do that and drive the price down to something basically less than £100, £200 a week, we think it gives people a reassurance that we may get back basically to work en masse and not just basically in a fearful way.
But this just all seems like, what, you know, why isn't this happening on a bigger scale? Why
to innovate? Why do you need startups to innovate? Because they can, and because they can be quick, and because they can make mistakes, and because they can fail, and no one cares.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we haven't backed more vaccines is the governments are frightened of backing a vaccine with money and it failing. Saying, do experiments. Most experiments fail, and it doesn't matter. You learn from them. Yeah. But you don't, kind of basically stop doing experiments because you're frightened of the basically criticism you get by backing, say, a vaccine program that doesn't work.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of comes to the next, so we're looking beyond the pandemic and what will happen next. And, you know, Mark Andreessen's kind of wrote a sort of polemic really about the pandemic and what opportunities it basically removing blocks to innovation, sort of shaking up the world order to allow innovation and, you know, to build something, because now we kind of have a sort of almost like a scorched earth situation. So I was just kind of wondering what your perspective was on, you know, how the pandemic has really removed the blocking factor that might have held up innovation.
I think partly in the pandemic, and the UCL basic Mercedes cap was a good point, is that it allowed collaboration for a mission. And so people were all worried about, oh, who owns what, whose IP, who does this, etc., which means that everything gets delayed and no one does anything. So that because there was a kind of very defined mission and a very short time frame, people were able to act. And in crisis, this brings forth innovation. And I think what one of the parts that Mark Andreessen points out is true, is that, you know, if we can have a common mission, people are prepared to collaborate, and if they collaborate, they get things done quicker, and they actually generate great things as well. I wonder how much that will preserve going forward. And I do kind of note a couple of notes of caution. Obviously, Andreessen Horowitz is one of the world's greatest VCs, and obviously they invest across the board. But only 9% of investment in the USA from all VCs, and including Andreessen, look at their portfolio, goes into deep tech, goes into science innovation for startups. Famously, 2 weeks after we produced that, Andreessen basically put 100 million into Clubhouse, which is a social media kind of basic platform for the incredibly well connected, kind of like, you know, which is about business model innovation and about making a niche and basically exploiting that, and etc. Not about basically having an underlying technology that solves a big scientific or engineering logjam. And so, do I see that will be increased from the investor's point of view? I think there's a big headwind against that, and that is investors' own conservatism. investors are probably going to want to back sure things. And the truth is, deep tech is the least sure thing you can probably invest in.
Yeah.
And therefore, I suspect the money will go to later. It will go to companies that are basically proving it can trade well through this pandemic. And I think it will go, and I think there'll be even more emphasis on traction numbers.
And the other thing that has really changed is telemedicine. Obviously, you and I do a lot of work in the precision medicine field. And one thing that it's shown is that the way that medicine has worked to this point, where you go, you know, and this, I'm aware that we have an international audience, but in the UK, you make an appointment to see your GP and you might get an appointment 3 weeks hence, and then you go in and you're kind of rationed to sort of 15 minutes and then you're referred on and so on and so forth. And there had always been a reluctance to do sort of telemedicine in this sort of Babylon Health kind of way of things. But that seems to now be lessened, or is that my imagination?
No, it has. I mean, it's gone from something like 2% to almost 90% of all consultations were done through telemedicine, through, you know, kind of Zoom and, you know, Skype and other consultations on the phone, etc. Will that sustain? Will that basically, because I think the problem of what we call telemedicine or remote medicine has been the qualitative nature of it, which is, you know, they ask you, how do you feel? And you go, oh, I feel, and unlike in the doctor's surgery, they can't then pull out their devices to actually get accurate measurements, basically say on your vital signs or on others. And I think what telemedicine happened on a great time because the infrastructure was set up, but happened probably in the COVID, this is bad timing really to say this, but if in 2 years' time, the tools will be available, clinical tools, which will allow you en masse to basically to get those clinical data. So I think personally, remote medicine basically will come in. I don't think this COVID crisis has basically conquered it completely. And today, for instance, we had a headline in one of our major national newspapers saying that there's 2.4 million patients in the UK that have missed their basic cancer diagnostic session since COVID.
Yeah.
You know, and therefore, basically, how much cancer is a disease, but basically your prognosis of survival is about how early they detect it.
Early, yeah.
You can see that there could be a terrible unintended consequence that more people die, not from COVID, but from cancer because of this basically pandemic epidemic. But that doesn't have to be. There are already, we know basic companies that you can do this. The technology is already there, but it hasn't been adopted. It hasn't been regulated. It basically is 1 to 2 to 3 years away. If this happens again, if pandemics are going to be a regular occurrence in going ahead in future, then I think that in the next pandemic, God help us, we'll be able to get a full medical basically service remotely and not a partial one as we can do today.
Well, we've only got 10 minutes left and we haven't had any questions. So I'm going to just suggest that we keep plodding through. And, you know, the last 10 minutes, I wanted to have a chat about sort of practical issues for growing companies. I mean, what I have seen, we talked about offensive versus defensive strategies. And sort of extending that runway. And obviously we have a number of clients who are now looking at when they are going to next be able to raise and thinking it might be further out than they thought. So we've been helping them to kind of plan for that. What have you come across, John, particularly?
I think one of the things that's happened to all tech companies in this, and all companies, is we've realized how important the state is. Whether it's a PPP scheme in the States, whether it's basically the schemes we've had here, like furlough, or the future fund, which we may come on to, and others, is that in the end, when you have a crisis, you're reliant on your state to to basically help out. And
Yeah.
those that have weak states or states with very little money have been much more impacted than those that have strong states or financially viable states. And lucky in Britain, we are one of those. And you have to say we've done quite a bit to basically prop up businesses.
We have done quite a bit, but the Future Fund was 500 million, and it was
250 million actually, 250 matched. It's quite small beer.
Matched, and then it basically was out on the day that it opened, the applications opened, and I'm pretty sure it was completely overrun.
It's at least 3 times oversubscribed. Yeah. It's probably more like 4 now. We're hopeful that the Chancellor will announce in probably the next 10 days some more money for it. Mm-hmm. We think it's a fantastic scheme in many ways, even though there are some drawbacks to it. And it's been demonstrated. And I think it's one of the few schemes that any government's going to do to support business where they're probably going to make money. They're going to have good stakes in 500 VC-backed startups in the UK. They're going to have the best index fund at CDA that's ever been created. And if they can't make money out of it, it's because the entire system collapses, not because they missed any of the good deals.
There was a bit of snippiness on Twitter and other social media about propping up companies that really didn't deserve to be propped up, which is usually very successful entrepreneurs.
Well, there's and yet some of those, some well-known, 1 or 2 of them, basically have also applied for it. So, so we know they're VC partners. I think actually, to some extent, there's always been a pride in tech to be the loner, to be the person that basically did it on their own. Yeah. I remember basically we did a report on the London Co-Investment Fund, and they had to go and speak to the founders. And what the universal thing it came back from them is the founders said, yeah, the investment was fine, but we would have made it without it. And I remember basically speaking to the people that evaluated that and said, it's very odd. We normally do the creative sector. The creative sector, everyone gets thanked. Your cleaner gets thanked. The taxi driver gets thanked. Everyone gets thanked. It's all a collaborative. Every single person that we've talked to in the tech wants to have that they beat the odds. It was them. They were David against Goliath. They fought off their own. They didn't, and it's interesting. But you do become reliant. You become reliant on your team. You become reliant on your basic customers, the real ones that are going to back you, and you become reliant on your investors. And I think in this stage, everyone's realised how much reliant they become on their state as well. And you're right. I mean, the truth is that I think basically investing in innovation-focused businesses that basically can create something new, that can basically build a new business model, that can basically build something that can be exported across, is probably a much better spending of money than propping up basically golf clubs in the middle of Scotland.
Who happen to be owned by the US president.
You said that.
Yeah. So I'm a Scot, so I feel I have some skin in that particular game. So the other things just to talk about is some advice that we've been giving to various companies is about, going concern issues, whether or not the company can continue to trade. So whether or not insolvency tests can be met, keeping in touch with their investors maybe more often than, if you're coming down to the sort of end of your funding, and it's about being proactive with investors, making sure that they're aware about the company's financial situation, checking banking covenants and any other covenants that you might have that the company might have given, checking the terms of your shareholders agreement, and making sure that you're fully compliant with that all the time. We should talk about, because we talk about the state's interaction. They've actually put a moratorium on winding up related to COVID until the end of June. And whether or not I think we'll still be in the midst of it at the end of June. So whether or not that will be continued after that, but who knows. And then furloughing, obviously furloughing is now being wound down a little bit, but query whether or not we go back onto if there's a second peak and a second lockdown, what will happen in that situation. My partner, Bob Cordon, has done regular updates on the furlough scheme, and they're all available on the Doherty website. And then obviously we've got Brexit as well, which is kind of happening in the background, but at the end of June, if we haven't extended, we are leaving at the end of the year, regardless of what else happens.
Yeah, I think one thing I think is noticeable, it may be controversial, is because of our government and I think actually our population, is it it's become apparent we're becoming less and less a European nation almost daily. And in our own kind of sui generis kind of island nation again.
Yeah.
You see, by the way, how we've coped with this crisis and measures we've taken. You're right. You know, one thing that Britain has been incredibly open and being seen as an international entry port. COVID obviously has stopped that.
Yeah.
You know, the world's busiest international airport was Heathrow. It no longer is. Probably somewhere in China, I suspect.
Yeah.
And obviously you know, we were attracting 500,000 immigrants from Europe every year, particularly for the tech sector. They're not likely to come, you know, if they wanted to. And the universities are going to lose all their overseas students next year. So we are going to go much more kind of almost back to the 1960s and 70s, kind of basic British nation, and having to cope with that. And that will be interesting because at least for the next year to 18 months, I don't see that changing. And you can see in the States as well. I mean, the States basically, you know, kind of immigration rules are now the tightest I can ever recall them. And they've just brought in things for students to stop Chinese students, for instance, being able to study in the States. So, you know, it seems that nationalism and that basic go it alone kind of thing is happening everywhere.
Well, it's 2 minutes till 4, and I'd like to thank you, John. It's always fascinating chatting to you, and you know, I hope.
And there will be upsides, by the way. I do think there's some really interesting upsides coming up, and I'm really looking forward to the next 2 or 3 months because I think I'll start to see some amazing ideas I haven't seen before. I am convinced that squirreling away there in their basically kitchens, in their bedrooms, are fantastic founders building new basic technologies and new business models I have never seen before that are going to basically blow my mind.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who attended, and hope everyone keeps safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.